Okay, we're in the middle of a conversation and I
Yeah,
have to hit record. So it's
it's okay.
Friday. We're complaining about the cold, and I got friends back east in Buffalo. I don't think I've heard from them because they're snowed in or
Yeah.
whatever amount of snow that they're getting, and yet it drops below, 45, 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and that just is painful for us.
You want to know the worst part, John? Is like I have cold weather gear.
Yeah, right. You got
I have a
rain.
ton of it. And I have good cold weather gear, mostly because I bought it for races that were going to be cold.
Yeah, yeah,
And like I'm so soft now. Like I could easily have ridden my bike to work a couple days this
yeah,
week, and I didn't
yeah.
because I have this beautiful setup. It's like literally right here.
Right.
It's indoor. I've got the fans. I've got a TV, and I'm like, yeah, I just
Yeah,
I'll get home from work and I'll jump on the trainer, or get up in the morning and jump on the trainer,
yeah,
and I don't have to like get frost in my mustache.
yeah. Well, it just takes so long to get ready too. I mean, we're like two old guys now. Just it takes,
True.
15 minutes to get dressed to go for a ride now. So,
Or longer by the time I find all the gear. And it's so weird. Like we are so soft because
oh,
if we
totally.
were where we were either of us were from, oh man, 50 degrees, let's go out
No.
and sunny, let's go ride. Like
Yeah.
it would be so easy to do.
Oh, in yeah, back east when I was riding it, I'd go out and I'd put my snow goggles on to
Yep.
stay warm because you don't want any cold air hitting your face. And so it was yeah, now it's like, yeah, it's terrible. Yeah, and it's so funny because we always say, if you train here, you can race anywhere,
It's
but
true.
I don't know about that. Maybe this is one exception.
So the other question I was surprised, I mean, in our pre-show, you didn't ask me about is if I got my Taylor Swift tickets.
Oh yeah, did you?
I sure did.
Oh, you got to be kidding me. How'd you get them?
I am a super fan,
Oh,
and the super fans got codes. And
yeah, that all seemed to crash the system.
when you're a super fan and you got multiple computers going, you can
Oh,
get tickets to Taylor Swift. I'm so excited.
awesome. That's great.
Yeah. So I thought you might ask because there's very few people that know about my Taylor Swift addiction, but you're one of them.
Hey, I have lots of Taylor Swift songs on my podcast list for riding because it's just an
It just picks you
upbeat,
up.
yeah, upbeat type of music. So
Yep.
it's certainly fun.
So it pays to be a super fan.
That's great. Where is it at?
It's at the Allegiant Stadium.
Okay.
So in March.
All right. That's great.
So, I'll have to train my vocal cords for that one to get ready to scream. I'm
That's great.
really the only 50-year-old man there singing the songs. It's gonna
No,
be great.
I don't. Yeah, no, there'll be a few like that. So taking their daughters maybe, or who knows
Exactly.
what. But are you
Exactly.
taking Marie?
We're going together. Yeah,
Awesome. Yeah, that's great.
it's gonna be good. So,
Yeah, that'll be fun.
uh,
Good.
so it's been like 2 weeks. We rarely have a hiatus, but we're back at it tonight, and we're going to talk about graded exercise testing, which I don't think we've really touched on too much. And I'm super excited to talk about it because I think that there's a lot of misconceptions about what it is, and well, most people will think about it. Maybe you've heard, maybe not even heard of what a graded exercise test is, John. So, do you want to break down what a graded exercise test is?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people just refer to it as a VO2 max test. And so a lot of people know that phrase VO2 max, which is the maximum rate that you can use oxygen. And a graded exercise test is a test to try to determine what that maximum rate is. And
Okay.
it is exactly what it sounds like. It's a graded exercise test. So what's graded is
Now,
the
what's the
intensity.
grade?
I know, that's right. We're so simple in our area. It's like,
Yeah, I know. It's in school we get grades A, B, C, D.
yeah,
It's not
yeah,
that kind of grade.
yeah. And so it's simply a grading of the intensity. So you
Okay.
start off super easy, and then you grade to another intensity, a little bit more, a little bit lower, more, a little bit more, and eventually you reach an intensity that you just can't keep going. And that's a maximum effort graded exercise test. Now there are submaximal tests, but what we're going to talk about tonight is the maximum effort. So going all the way to the point that you cannot continue.
Can we just really quickly jump on that sub-maximal? Because
Yeah.
I used to work out at a gym and they were testing people all the time and they were doing sub-maximal tests and they were predicting maximal.
That's right. So to do that, it's purely a prediction. It's a math equation. So what you do is you do usually three levels of submaximum, sort of something really easy, something moderate, and maybe something hard as well. And then what you do is you extrapolate those data out to a point that would be your age predicted heart rate max.
Oh, okay.
And
Based on
so, yeah,
formula.
and so I'll bring up some data in just a bit, but all you're doing is taking those 3 points, connecting the dots in essence, but you're connecting with you're fixing a straight line there. And then you're going to continue that line out to where you would hit your age predicted max heart, so 220 minus your age. And then they use that as the estimate for VO2 max. I'll show on the data on a graph in just a bit.
Okay, awesome. So the other question I had in your definition was you said the maximum amount of oxygen that you can use.
Hmm.
So this sounds to me like an aerobic test.
Yes, and it is. It's a test of aerobic fitness or cardiorespiratory fitness. Now, there's another term that goes along with this. I'll get to that point in just a second, but there's a stress test. And a lot of people who are our age may know more about a stress test. The doctor prescribes it. And a
Right.
stress test is simply a graded exercise test, usually to max effort or what we call symptom limited. So you may be having heart problems and you go to the doctor and says, hey, I'm having some heart problems. And he says, well, let's order a stress test. And a stress test simply involves specifically EKG and maybe an echo. And so they may also call it a stress echo test. And an echocardiograph is just taking that ultrasound of the heart at before the exercise and at the very end of the exercise. And it's often we call it symptom limited because if I'm exercising, well, I used to work in cardiac rehab back in the day, and we used to do these stress tests all the time. And what we actually wanted to do was hit an intensity where the person did have the symptoms.
Yeah.
And so we would grade that intensity, and then they'd say, oh, I'm starting to have that chest pain. I'd quickly print the EKG, we'd stop the test, we'd put them down on the bed and do the echocardiograph because that's where the heart was being stressed to a point where there was pain. And
Yeah.
so then they'd say, oh, I failed the test. And it's like, no, that's actually a good test when we can mimic the pain that you went to the doctor to in the first place. So
Right.
a stress echo is simply a graded exercise test that you stop either when you start having symptoms of heart problems, dizziness, maybe your tunnel vision starts to happen, or you have chest pain, or you go to a point where you can't continue.
Okay.
And
So,
so the VO2 part is exactly what you said. It's aerobic. And
and
so,
I want to just clarify this because I think it's super important that we understand this is aerobic, right?
mm,
Because we end up going into some pretty deep places as
yeah, yeah,
far as our heart rate, right? Like very close to maximum heart rate.
no,
And I think that there's a misconception when you work really hard that it's anaerobic.
right, right, right. It's
But this is truly a measure of the end, the very top of your aerobic system.
yeah,
Even if at the top you're, let's say on a bike, you're doing 400 watts,
yeah.
you're utilizing a tremendous amount of oxygen
Hmm.
to make that happen. And so this is aerobic. And I think that that's a really important thing. Because I've read on blogs and I've read in different places, they're talking about, oh, when you're above FTP, you're anaerobic.
Right, right,
And you're not anaerobic
Mhm.
at that
Right,
point. Now there's contributions of the anaerobic system,
right.
but most of the contributions are still very much aerobic. Am I
Oh,
correct in
you
this?
were spot on with that. And you're right that this is a misconception because we have this phrase that we actually use this test to determine the anaerobic threshold. And what often gets thought, or even our students often think this, is that's where the anaerobic system is turned on. And sometimes people even think that's where the aerobic system's turned off. And no, that's not the case at all. That's
Yeah,
not
because
it.
we're seeing the air go in and out, and we're
That's
measuring
right.
it's
That's
definitely
right.
aerobic.
You continue to breathe hard. But at some point during this graded exercise test, you do reach an intensity where the anaerobic system also starts to contribute to generate the what's needed to keep muscles contracting. And it just increases how much it's contributing, but at the same time, your aerobic system that's using oxygen is continuing to power the engine predominantly.
And creep up, right? Like
Okay.
I think that's the piece here that is missing is I think that it's this misconception that when the anaerobic system starts to have more influence, that
Yeah.
the aerobic system goes down.
Right.
But
Yeah.
it doesn't. It goes up and
It's
up and
still
up, and
going up.
eventually it'll plateau because it'll maximum out, and that's
That's
what we're truly
that's
looking
the
for, right?
idea. Yeah.
That's it. That's the idea. But that's means that that is the most aerobic you could
Right.
possibly be.
Hmm.
You just added anaerobic on it, so you're actually, it's kind of like you have a hybrid car,
Hmm.
and you're utilizing two systems at once, like the
Yeah.
battery and the gas are
Yeah.
happening at the same time. Is
Yep.
is that a good analogy?
No, that's perfect. That's
Okay.
exactly right. Yeah.
'Cause
And
honestly, I read a lot of stuff, and
yeah.
this gets misconceived so often.
Yeah.
And I think it's important that we get this straight, right, before we get into some of the
Yeah.
details. Okay.
Yeah, and it's like two engines. And the problem with that analogy is sometimes the aerobic system is the electric and sometimes the anaerobic is the electric. So we'll
Yeah.
leave that, but it's like having two engines.
Yeah.
And all we're doing, or all our body does, is we're converting chemical energy. So our carbohydrates, our fats, they have stored energy. That's what when you look on your package of what you just ate, it says calories.
Right.
That's stored energy. That's all that is. That's potential chemical energy. And what our body does is it takes that potential chemical energy and transforms it, in essence, to mechanical energy. And I'm sure people have heard ATP. That's just another chemical form of energy that's then used in the muscle to actually allow for that physical contraction of the muscle. So that's why I always say we're taking chemical energy and we're transforming it to mechanical energy. Just like your car, it's taking chemical energy and gas or the battery, and it's transforming that gas energy to mechanical energy to make the wheels turn. All right. And it does that through combustion or burning of the gas. Well, that's the same thing that our body does is it uses oxygen to transform the chemical energy in the fats and carbohydrates and pulls that over to mechanical energy.
I love the fact that you went down this road, because one of the things when I talk to my students about this is trying to explain like what a calorie is, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think you did a really good job of that. And we, like, not we, but when we determine the calorie content of a food, you burn it,
Yeah.
right?
Right. That's right.
So there's a special furnace that you can,
Yeah.
I don't remember the name of it, calorimeter,
Kilometer. Yeah.
kilometer, that's right.
Yeah.
And so you put an apple in this thing and it burns it, and it measures how much energy is basically
Yep.
made, or how much heat actually
Yep.
is made from this, and you can determine how many calories. And that's basically what the body is ultimately doing, is it's actually burning this.
Yep.
And obviously it's not a fire inside of us, but it's still it's ultimately this process. So I think that this is such a, I don't know, such a
Yeah.
good thing to understand, is people don't, I don't think people understand when they look at the package of their Cliff Bar and it says 230 calories,
Hmm.
what that actually means.
Yeah.
It means that's the potential in that to be
That's
utilized
right.
in our bodies.
No, you are spot on with that. And what's funny is because we're going to get to our graded exercise test that we did in the lab, that's actually using a system we call indirect kilometry.
Yep.
It's indirect. The direct way, as the classic way of doing VO2, is to pump someone in that special room that you're talking about, put
Yep.
them in that oven, and they exercise in that room. And that room actually is built with special sensors to figure out how much the heat is changing in the room.
Yep.
That's direct kilometry. So you're actually measuring the heat that the body's generating during exercise. But we don't do that. It's too complicated, too long. So we instead do indirect kilometry. We actually measure the gases that the person is breathing in and exhaling. And then we use that to figure out how many calories they used. And that calorie is exactly what you talk about. It's heat. That's all it is. It's a
Yep.
unit of heat. And anytime we transform energy from one form to another, it's never a perfect process. And but what happens is, thermoregulation rules, you have to have the same amount of energy at time one as time two. And so if you have so much chemical energy and you only transform it to a fraction of mechanical energy, that other energy has to go somewhere, and that somewhere is heat. And so when we have this process of going from chemical to mechanical energy, we're also generating heat.
And we've talked about this when we talked about overheating
Yeah.
probably in the summer,
you know,
and how inefficient our bodies actually are.
uh,
And the percentage is something like 80% of our energy goes to heat, and 20%.
yeah, that's about right. Yeah. Yeah.
If we're and we all think, oh, we're such efficient runners. No, you're not that efficient.
You're efficient at generating heat.
You were very efficient at
Yeah,
generating.
and that's why we shiver when we're cold, because we're in essence our body's actually trying to generate heat to keep us warm. So we're very efficient at generating heat. No, 80%, 75, 80% of the chemical energy gets transformed over to heat.
Yeah.
And so that's a lot of heat that we end up generating. And that's part of thermoregulation. We want to get rid of that heat in hot environments. We want to retain that heat in cold environments.
Yeah. Awesome. Good. This is such a good
Yeah.
background for this.
I might as well, as long as we're on this chemical mechanical energy,
Yeah.
the other part that goes along with this, and this is where we'll get back to the cycling as well, is how fast we transform energy from one form to another is power.
Yeah.
All right. That's what power, yes, power is mechanically a rate of work being done, but you can also work the equations a little bit, and it ends up being how fast we're transforming chemical energy to mechanical energy. If we do it really, 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 really fast, like a 1 RM bench press, we probably need to use a system that transforms that chemical energy to mechanical energy really quickly, and that would be the anaerobic system. But when we're trying to contract muscle over a long period of time, like in a marathon or an Ironman, you don't need as much rate of transformation of chemical energy, and so your power is lower. So even though we talk about power being pretty demanding in cycling, the numbers are reasonably, they're high, but not like super high. But
They're actually really low.
That's right, because
to
aerobic power for an Ironman, if we do 200 watts, that's great. 300 watts was Sam Laidlow at Kona, just over 300 watts. For a sprint cyclist, we're talking well over 1,000 watts.
Or think about somebody, John, doing a 1 RM squat.
Yeah, right.
I think it's measured in like 3,000 watts or something. It's
And
not us mortals, but
yeah,
but it's so much greater, because we think about, 300 watts is huge. Well, 3,000 watts doing a squat is a tremendous amount of power.
And that power is the same power as the power we do on biking or running or whatever, even though it's lower. And so it's just a rate of transforming energy from the chemical state to mechanical state. For the power events like 1 RM, that's anaerobic power. When we talk about cycling and running endurance, that's where we get into aerobic power. So how fast can we transform chemical energy to mechanical energy in an aerobic process using oxygen? Because that we can do for a long period of time.
I can't remember. You might know the number on this one. These guys that can do like the 48-inch box jump. So there was some kind of crazy number. Jumping up 4 feet is crazy in itself, and it was something like 3,000 or 4,000.
Oh, really?
Watts.
I don't doubt that.
Just to spring their body up.
Yeah.
And once again, you start thinking about what 3,000 or 4,000 watts is on your kicker, your power meter can't even measure that.
No.
And once again, but it's a totally different energy system, right? This is
the same parameter. It's power, but it's a different energy system. And so to test the anaerobic system, there's different tests for that. Like you said, the box jump, or different ways to tease out how fast we can transform energy from the chemical state to mechanical state. The graded exercise test, that's a test of aerobic power. That's a test that we do over a period of time, anywhere from, the shortest would probably be 5 minutes. That's really short, but 8 to 12 minutes, maybe 15 minutes long. And we're grading the intensity. And what we're trying to do is stress the system in a way that we can figure out the fastest that you can transform chemical energy to mechanical energy using the aerobic system.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So what are we ultimately, John, what are we actually measuring then?
So we are measuring how much oxygen we're actually using in our body. The way we do that is we put a face mask on the person and we measure the air that they're breathing in
So
And we
like
measure
the ambient air, so
that's
we
right,
we know
ambient
how much
air.
oxygen's in there, right?
That's right, 21% oxygen in the air.
Yep.
And then we also measure the air that they exhale.
Okay, so
And
if
then we
it's
have a
21% in, it's gonna be obviously less coming
something
out,
less. Exactly. And
and
so
then that's the net that we're measuring, right?
that's right. And so that we have a computer that's hooked up that has oxygen sensors, has carbon dioxide sensors, and it's measuring both the intake and the outtake, and then taking, in essence, the difference between those. And then the lower oxygen in the exhaled air is because our body used that to transform the chemical energy to mechanical energy. And chemically, what happens is that oxygen is pulled into, I'm sure people have heard, we've got a pretty smart audience, but it's pulled into the mitochondria and it's used to in the chemical breakdown of carbohydrates and fats to yield the adenosine triphosphate, which is used in muscle contraction. And it also yields carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide is exhaled. So when we're exercising, we're using oxygen, and then we're exhaling carbon dioxide.
Okay, so this is so good. And if I'm going too fast, please stop me, but
Yeah,
is this something that we can train and can improve?
it's the whole idea behind training. That's right. Well,
Okay,
actually, I take that back. There's two ideas in training. We can't forget the coordination issue of training,
right,
and
efficient.
that's right. So we got to be able to generate the right amount of force at the right amount of time in the right direction. There's a coordination issue or efficiency, a movement skill that we have in swimming, biking, and running. So that is real, and we know that inexperienced people are not as fast as experienced people because of a skill that is related to each of these sports. But yes, a lot of our training, what we're trying to do is train how fast we can transform chemical energy to mechanical energy aerobically. So everything we're doing is trying to increase the blood flow to muscles, to deliver more oxygen to the muscle, or we're trying to produce more elements in the muscle that allow, like mitochondria, that allow for aerobic metabolism of carbohydrates and fats.
Okay. So if I take an athlete and I don't know, let's say it's the beginning of the season, they've, taken a few months off,
Hmm.
test them, and then we train all year. Theoretically, if we do good training, they should become aerobically better,
Yes.
and we should be able to measure that with something like this.
That's right. And so here's where the details start to get a little muddy, though.
Okay.
If we take someone who's training right now and we test them, we may actually see a VO2 max at whatever level. Let's just follow the number, 60 mLs per kg per minute. And we can go through the units later. And then we put them through a training program, and they come back in 5 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, whatever it is, and we test them again, they may actually have the same VO2 max, but they may be performing better.
Oh, this is
Yeah,
tricky.
so it's not always VO2 max that's important. It's often the ability to race at a level that's close to your maximum effort.
Yeah, I love this. So this is something that also you see in a lot of the blogs is like percentage of VO2 that
Yeah,
you could
yeah,
race at,
yeah,
right? So it's what is it? Percentage of VO2 at your FTP or at your run threshold
yeah, yeah.
is what we see a lot in the
Lots of
literature.
different names for it. Yeah, that's right.
So if you could race at 90% of your maximum
Yeah,
today, and a month ago you could race at 80% of your maximum, even though your maximum didn't go up,
right.
you are obviously going to be able to go faster.
That's right. That's
Okay,
right. Yep. And that's part of training is to improve how high, how close you can race to that maximum effort. Now, now this again, where it gets a little muddy, because if I take someone, like you said, from the couch and I test them in the beginning, their VO2 max may be reasonable. But then as you train them, they may actually have a bigger capacity to increase their VO2 max. And so
yep,
you may actually see a change in VO2 max. And so this is where some of our training studies get really sort of hard to interpret because it depends on what type of person they're starting with. If they're
yeah,
starting with someone who's not fit in the beginning, a lot of times any training intervention will improve VO2 max
yeah.
because you started with someone who was untrained to begin with. But if you start with someone who's already trained, what an intervention does, it may be quite different.
So this is so good that you talk about this. So this is the evidence-based triathlete. And whenever we read an article, I mean, one of the most important things I look at is who was your subject,
That's right.
right? A moderately trained collegiate college student
No.
or an elite athlete, and they define elite athlete as had minimum qualifications, was on their national team and competed at a world championship.
Right.
That's an elite athlete.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of gray area when you just sometimes they don't define it really well.
Mm-hmm.
What what an elite athlete is, or what an age group athlete is. And the thing that I find really interesting is oftentimes they define it based off of their VO2.
Yeah, right. That's true. And that's not really correct.
I know, but they do it all the time. It's like, well, they're an elite athlete because their VO2s are between 50 and 60.
That's right.
I'm like, that's not elite.
Wow.
Well, maybe it would be elite for someone.
It could be. That's
if they're old enough. Well, yeah.
No, and this is really good you brought this up, because VO2 max by itself is a very poor predictor of endurance performance. I'm going to show a table of a variety of elite runners who have VO2 maxes maybe from 65 mLs per kg per minute to 78 mLs per kg per minute. And in some races, depending on distance, it could be a 10K, maybe half marathon or marathon, the 65 ml per kg per person is outperforming the one someone athlete in the 70s. So VO2 max by itself is not a great predictor of endurance performance. It is a good predictor of cardiorespiratory fitness, and it's really good to go back and get repeated testing, because now you can compare your data to you. Yeah. And I've seen my VO2 max, as I've gotten older, it's just gone down. That's predictable. When I worked in cardiac rehab, we would often we would identify some of our at-risk patients when their VO2 max was maybe 10 mLs per kg per minute. All right, that's just resting is like 3.5 mLs per kg per minute. That's what we're using right now in terms of oxygen. 10 is like 3 times, that's like walking upstairs. And that when you get that type of value that's so low, your activities of daily living are not good, and you really go down a real negative health path.
And this is something we should all be fighting.
We should be, because the higher you can get it when you're younger, the better. But it's not too late. No matter what age you are, you have the ability to increase your VO2 max. You do, especially if you're at the coming from the couch. Your VO2 max will go up with good training.
Yep, agreed. Okay, so let's talk about the actual test then, John, and how it's run, and maybe what we look for when we do the test and the test results.
Yeah, so we would put someone on, we would call the test, we would identify the mode of exercise, which is just which way we're going to do it. We're going to do it swimming, biking, or running. And the way that you do the test, or which mode you choose, will actually influence the value that you can potentially reach. And running on a treadmill typically ends up yielding the highest VO2 max data, whereas swimming will be typically the lowest, but it depends. It depends on if you've got swimmers swimming and then swimmers running, or if you got runners running and runners swimming, then all bets are off in terms of what's going to happen. So again, that goes back to the skill level of an activity does come into play. But for most of our audience, they will most likely, if they do a graded exercise test, they're typically do either a treadmill test or a bike test. And the data can be different on those tests because of the amount of muscle that you're using during each activity, either biking or running. And running tends to be higher.
In general, you're going to be using more muscle running than you are cycling.
That's right.
And it's interesting. I was reading an article that was talking about like rowers, for example.
Yeah.
Having super high VO2s because they're using so much more muscle. A really good rower will use so much of their legs, their back, their arms, and they'll put out crazy high numbers. But then you put them on a bicycle, and they still have high numbers, right? But they're lower because they're using less muscle, so less oxygen is actually being utilized.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And that's great. And the same thing happens when we look at runners who are predominantly lower extremity, or a lot of muscle in the lower extremity. Their upper bodies are really very skinny, or not a lot of muscle mass on the upper bodies. And so when you start running, the majority of your active muscles are the ones that are used in running. And so that's why,
Yep.
we talk about relative VO2 and mLs per kilogram body mass per minute. That kilogram body mass, sometimes we actually look at the units differently. We look at active muscle mass versus inactive muscle mass, just like you're talking about.
So let's pause again because I want to get your opinion on something. Once again, I was reading something that said the best way to raise your VO2 max fast is lose weight.
I haven't looked at the math of that, but
But if you think about it, if you
yeah.
ran the same speed or whatever, and you
Yeah.
were 2 pounds less,
Mm-hmm.
and then why I brought this up is because you'd mentioned that this is relative, and it's
Yeah.
in the last piece of this of when we measure this is per kilogram.
Kilogram body mass. Yeah.
Right? So if you weigh less,
Yeah. Yeah. Because your denominator goes down and your
denominator
numerator
down.
goes up. So,
So
but
tricky
it's a problem. And this is where we've talked about race weight,
Yeah.
because you can get to a point where you have lost weight and you've actually are doing yourself a disservice, and your performance is already going down. So you may not be able to run the same speed.
and why I brought it up, John, is oftentimes people will conflate that and they'll think, oh, look, my aerobic system has gotten so much better, but it hasn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've actually
Right.
just lost weight.
Yeah.
And so a good coach or a good physiologist will understand that this got better because of the weight loss, not because your training was better.
No, you're spot on. And to take it a step further, this is why we're often normalize the data not to total body mass, but to fat-free mass. So
Yeah,
we would put them on a a scale and get their body composition from like a bioimpedance scale,
Yeah.
and then we would just use the active mass for that normalization. And this is actually a study that I need to get one of our grad students to do, is because when you do a long distance run, your body mass will change.
Yep.
And I've always wanted to just do, let's record what's happening with body weight during a run, and then mathematically what is happening to VO2 simply because your body mass is changing, because we're divided by body mass. That's a sidetrack, but
I actually think we should do this, but do it on a bike. I think you can.
yeah, we could do it on the bike too. Yeah, that'd be fine.
Right? Because I think like it's hard to run for 3 hours.
Yeah. Well, on the bike, actually, it'd be easier because we could put a scale under the stationary bike, and we can actually monitor the
Monitor it
whole
live,
weight
right?
in real time. Oh, okay.
Yeah. And have people ride for 3 hours, and
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, and you can monitor they can still drink because you're just
Yeah.
monitoring the weight loss.
All right. We got to get a student to do that one.
I think
Students, if you're listening,
this is
reach
a
out.
good little project right here.
All right. So now VO2 max, something I should have said earlier on is we often say VO2 peak as well. And when we start talking about these different modes of exercise, it's good to recognize that VO2 peak and VO2 max, they're sort of the same, but they're sort of different. VO2 peak is just the highest VO2 that we see during one of these tests. And it's the highest for that test, whatever it is. So VO2 peak is typically lower on the bike versus on the run, or lower on the swim versus the run, something like that. But VO2 max is a special number that is representing the maximum rate that our body can use oxygen to convert chemical energy to mechanical energy. Actually figuring out what that VO2 max is not easy.
Oh, it's
And
super.
we most likely, probably 95% of our tests are VO2 peak tests, because we stop running at the end of the test for a wide variety of reasons. It could just be, another way of looking at fatigue, which we all talk about as a general tiredness. Tiredness is a prediction of how much more we can actually do. And so we're not typically going to a point where we are physically falling off the treadmill. But the elite athletes are going to be really close.
It's so fun that you say that, because pretty much everyone I've ever tested gets off in about 2 or 3 minutes later. Oh, I could have went.
Yeah.
Could have went 30 more seconds.
Yeah.
Dang, I know I could have. I'm like,
Yeah.
no, you couldn't have, because that's why you stopped.
Yeah.
Like in your mind, in your whatever it is,
Yeah.
because you stop because you actually think you're gonna die.
Yeah.
But you're not gonna die.
No.
Right? Like you actually could go 30 more seconds.
No.
And it's really interesting as someone that, John, you and I have both done lots of these tests
Mm-hmm.
ourselves. And we know this and we still stop,
Yep.
right? I can go further, like I think mentally on a bike than I can on the treadmill because I'm
Uh-huh.
not afraid to fall off.
That's right. That's the fear of falling is real, and I have had people fall off the
Yeah.
treadmill. And so, really, to get a good running VO2 max, it's nice if we do have a harness system
Yep.
because then it takes away that fear. This is why actually doing it on the body weight support treadmill could actually be helpful.
Oh
Is
yeah.
that yeah, you take away that fear of falling, and
Yeah.
it is real. And I have had people fall off the treadmill, and it's not a pretty sight.
Oh, because you and then John, I guess we should tell people some of the parameters. Like you're running fast,
Yeah,
and so the one we did last week, we actually had the athlete running at their 5K race pace,
yeah,
and then kept raising the grade, and I think
yeah.
it got to 12%, or was it 10%?
I didn't write that down. I think it was either 12 or 15%.
Yeah.
So,
So you're running a
no,
5K at your 5K flat race pace, and we
yeah,
just keep getting steeper and steeper
yeah,
and steeper. So you can just think about, running on a treadmill at your 5K race pace, which is
mhm,
for most people, that's fast,
yeah,
but now doing it up 12%.
right,
One wrong step
yeah,
and you're falling.
that's
And
right.
it
Hmm.
is scary, but we have to do that to ultimately get a good test. Like
Hmm.
especially running, you've got to run fast
Yeah,
and you've got to run up a hill to,
yeah,
to get
yeah.
us.
That's the whole idea. Is the intensity keeps getting harder and harder, and then eventually you can't keep going. That's the idea. And it is, oh man, I just had my brain just froze there for a second. So it is it's intensity that's graded when we're doing the, oh, I was going to say there's all different protocols. You're right. With the protocol we used had a certain way to get that graded intensity. But then there's other protocols where you're primarily walking, or it's primarily running on a level treadmill and you change the speed. There's different protocols to follow, and there's really no agreement on, there's no standard protocol to follow, but it needs to be graded. You want it to be in a certain time limit. You don't want it to go too long. At the end of a marathon, you finish, you're not at your VO2 max.
Nowhere near it.
At 100 meters, sprint, you're not reaching your VO2 max. So somewhere between those numbers, you got to build a protocol so that you're stopping the exercise somewhere between 5 and 15 minutes.
Because if you go too long, you end up getting fatigued, right?
Yeah, that's right.
You fatigue your system. What
Mhm.
ultimately, if you go too short, is it too much contribution of the anaerobic system? Is that
That's right. That's right. And what happens is it takes a little time for the VO2 engine to really sort of work. And so if you go too quick, you're actually overshoot with the anaerobic system, and you actually will start fatiguing sooner. And so you never give your VO2 engine, your aerobic power, a chance to actually develop.
yeah? Okay.
Where are we?
We need to talk about, so I think we've kind of figured this out, but let's talk about some, like what we actually get out of the results, and
Okay.
not just the pure number of VO2 max, but what we're looking at, what RER is.
Okay.
I mean, that seems to be like the hot one that we look at as long.
Yeah.
And then what does it mean ultimately, like how someone might utilize this data to affect their training? Um, yeah, affect their training.
All right. Well, let's see. You think I can share some data, which is great for our YouTube and our Facebook Live listeners,
Talk through it
not
though.
great for our audio, but
We could talk through it.
yeah, we'll talk through this. So let me bring up, we're talking about running on the treadmill. So let me bring up the treadmill running one data set that I have. And this is of one of our um, local athletes who came into the lab and did a test. And let me talk about this one right here. Uh,
So what we're looking at is VO2 on one axis and heart rate on the other, and time versus time.
That's right. So we've got time on the x-axis, VO2 on this y-axis,
Yep.
and heart rate on this y-axis, just so the data show up
And,
reasonably.
and you kept heart rate in red and VO2 in
Yep.
blue. Perfect.
Heart rate in red, this top line, and then blue is the rate of oxygen consumption.
Yep.
And so during this test, we had the person, like you said, they started out running, and then in specific time increments, the grade was changed to make the intensity harder. So as time goes along here, the exercise is getting harder and harder and harder. And so that's what's happening is this rate of oxygen consumption is going up and up and up and up. This is not perfect, it's going down. This is a breath by breath analysis, and I think this is 15-second time intervals. So sometimes you get, things in between breaths. So you see a little drop in the VO2 here, then it goes up and down and so forth. But overall, the trend is to go increase, increase, increase. And then there's this dramatic drop right here at the end. That's because he took the mask off because the test was done.
Yeah.
Once the mask comes off, we're no longer measuring what's coming in and out of the person. It's just measuring ambient air at that point. So really, I probably should not have included this data point right here. It's really this one right here. And so now you can see these data points near the end are sort of fluctuating a little bit, but they're really close to each other.
Yeah, they're
And
pretty
that
flat.
right there is the highest one, like 79.5 mLs per kg per minute. That's a big engine.
So that's peak.
That's peak. That's right. And
So
sometimes we,
how would we interpret max from this?
how do we get back? Well, this peak is likely also max. So VO2, every VO2 max is also VO2 peak, but all
Okay,
VO2 peaks are not necessarily VO2 max.
got it.
So, if he came back and did the test again, maybe now he knows the protocol better. Maybe his, routine coming into the test is a little different, and maybe he gets to 80 mLs per kg per minute. Remember, maximum is really what we want to get to, but we don't always get to max. Sometimes we stop for other reasons, and it's not because of lack of trying. It's just something else is going on that's causing us to stop. So his highest value here was 79.5 mLs per kg per minute. That's probably very close to whatever his maximum rate would be. Could be a different protocol, could get a little different number, but he's probably right around 79, 80 mLs per kg per minute for a max.
Yep.
And then heart rate goes along nicely with this.
Very linear.
Yeah, very linear. And that's very typical of heart rate is it will just increase with intensity. And that's because heart rate and VO2 are very tightly related to each other when we are doing especially aerobic exercise. All right, very related to each other. In fact, I actually put this graph here. This is VO2 on the y-axis, heart rate on the x-axis, and now I'm just plotting one data point against the other, and it's a nice linear line.
Yeah.
Very nice. What that means is I can measure heart rate to predict VO2.
Yep.
Which is very useful because it's so easy to measure heart rate.
Right.
Especially when we're out running. We just wear a heart rate monitor. And if I look at my heart rate and you say, oh, my heart rate's 165, that means my VO2 is probably, in this case, around 68 mLs per kg per minute.
And this is where it comes, the magic becomes, if you ask me,
Yes.
as for figuring out where you should be training,
That's right.
is at once again, if your heart rate's 165, what percentage of VO2 max you're at.
Yeah.
And training zones are often built off of this exact thing.
That's exactly why we measure heart rate. You're spot on. That all we're trying to do is use heart rate for a proxy of VO2.
Yeah.
That's
And it
what
works
we
really
want.
well because this is a pretty tight line.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so they're really related. Now, it's perfectly related if we also know two other things: how much blood is being pumped by the heart each beat, and how much oxygen is extracted from the blood as it circulates through the muscle. Then we know perfectly what VO2 is. But in the absence of knowing stroke volume and AVO2 difference, heart rate tends to be just a good predictor of VO2. It's not a perfect predictor, but it's a good predictor. All right, so let's see, you asked about RER as well. What we also measure in this test is VCO2. And so aerobic respiration means we're using oxygen and we're using some fuel, carbohydrate or fat. And as we break that down, the end product of that chemical reaction is ATP, which is then used for muscle contraction. So that's our energy. And then also CO2, also water, believe it or not, but also CO2. That CO2 is a byproduct of aerobic metabolism. Well,
Right.
CO2 is great, right? It's great to have CO2 because it's easy to get rid of. It just goes back into the bloodstream, goes back to the lungs, and then we exhale it and we get rid of that CO2. So it's a waste product from aerobic metabolism, but it's a waste product that's easy to get rid of. And so we also measure VCO2, and from knowing VO2 and VCO2 and knowing the chemical reactions, we can get a sense for what fuel is actually being used. And that's what RER represents, is a respiratory equivalent ratio, where we are taking the ratio of VCO2 relative to VO2, and then we know what substrate. When we're using carbohydrates, for every unit of oxygen we're using, we're expiring 1 unit of CO2, 1-to-1 match. And so that ratio is 1. When we're using fats, it's a little different chemical reaction. We may take in 23 units of oxygen and exhale 16 units of CO2, or vice versa. No, that's right, 16 CO2. So we're taking in a lot more oxygen to use fats than we are for carbohydrates relative to VCO2. And so a lower respiratory exchange ratio means that we're using more fats as a fuel. And we can pick that up from looking at VO2 and VCO2 data.
Okay. So we often hear the term crossover point. Is this where we see this?
Yep, that's this point right here, where the data on the y-axis here are either VO2 or VCO2 data, both in mLs per kg per minute. This is the same time of the test. And so this is the purple here. I should use different colors. Is the VCO2, and that's increasing. So we're expiring more carbon dioxide. And as we already saw, the VO2 is increasing as well. We're using more oxygen as we go along, but at some point we start expiring more VCO2 than we're using for oxygen.
Yep.
There's a couple of things that happen here. One is we're starting to use, we're going from primarily fats most likely as a fuel down in this easy region, and we're using carbohydrates more up in this region. And the reason is carbohydrates are easier to burn at a fast rate. They're quicker. It's quicker to get that chemical energy out of carbohydrates.
And let's once again add here, this is still aerobic.
It's all, that's right. Thank you. It's all aerobic. Now, the other reason why VCO2 is also increasing is the anaerobic system does start to contribute, but it's still aerobic. It does start to contribute, and a byproduct of anaerobic metabolism is lactic acid. One way to get rid of lactic acid is to buffer it, and then that buffering process actually yields VCO2. It yields carbon dioxide, and then we expire that as well. So that mixes with our aerobic metabolism byproduct of CO2. And so now we're not only getting rid of CO2 from aerobic metabolism, but we're also buffering lactic acid, which is giving VCO2. So that starts to go up really fast near the end of the test. And it starts we start to expire more and more CO2 than we use oxygen.
Awesome. This is so good. So you were saying that in the beginning here, he's utilizing probably more fat than than carbohydrates, but at a certain point, he's utilizing both, or he's utilizing both all the time, I guess.
That's right. That's right. Because
I misspoke. He's utilizing. It's just the percentage contribution, is what's ultimately changing as intensity goes up.
That's right. And the perfect test is we are stressing the aerobic system, and we're stopping because we're at max VO2.
Yeah.
What happens though is that the anaerobic system also starts to contribute at some point, and then eventually you do stop exercising. The trick is not to have the anaerobic system driving the reason why you're stopping.
So John, let's say we had the same test, but you saw the purple line, so the CO2, be very close to the O2 early.
Yeah.
What would that tell us?
Well, we would probably say something, and you and I have each done this when we saw some data like this from someone testing. I think we used the phrase, "Wow, you're a carb burner."
You're a carb burner. Well, and why I bring this up is because this is a hot topic, right?
Yeah, it is.
In endurance sports, is you want to be a fat burner.
Yeah.
And there's lots of different theories and ways you can do this. But if we see this in an endurance athlete, that you are basically utilizing a high percentage of carbohydrates at a relatively low intensity, we can do things in training to actually to change this.
Yeah.
Now, but there are also genetic issues with this.
Hmm.
So some people are more basically anaerobically gifted, as it were. Some people
Yeah.
are more aerobically gifted,
Yeah.
as it were. And so we can change this to a certain extent, but will always be the genetic, I guess I don't know, whatever the word is, the genetic precondition.
Predisposition. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and it goes along with how an athlete's built. And
Yeah.
we start drilling it down to slow twitch fibers, fast twitch fibers, things like that.
But we
Um,
can alter them.
we can. And remember when we talked with Dr. Jim Martin, he was talking about that that low intensity training relative to cadence may actually be driving a change in muscle fiber type, which I really like that cadence connection to that to what he was talking about. But that's the whole idea of training is we are trying to train our aerobic engine better, which means we can use more fuels at a faster rate. So we should be able to use fats at a faster rate. We just need more, we need more enzymes. We need more stuff in the muscle cell to allow for fat to be used. And it just takes, fat has a lot more steps to go from a fat to ATP. Glucose has less steps, it's faster. And then anaerobic system is even less steps. So it's even faster or the fastest out of those.
But we ultimately, like, to do that, it takes training.
Yes. Yeah.
It takes the appropriate type of training.
Mhm.
And obviously that's a little bit beyond the scope of this, but I mean, to train the aerobic system, you've got to train aerobically.
Yeah, you need to. I mean, it's you know, there's some different ideas here that sort of converge. Is that you have this high intensity training model, but you are really everything you're doing for endurance performances. You're trying to increase your capability to use fuels through the aerobic system. Everything you're doing, that's what you're trying to do. How you get there may be a little different, and that's where coaching comes into play. Is that not two athletes are going to look the same or respond the same way.
And that's the thing, is the individual response. And as a coach, seeing this stuff can really help determine how the training needs to go.
Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting one. This is kind of an interesting little side note. You can increase your VO2 max by never doing intensity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
And people don't believe that. They're like, oh no, I have to train at VO2 max to increase my.
Mm-hmm.
You don't necessarily have to.
No.
And depending on the person, it might not be the best thing for them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's good evidence on just doing, in the off season, people doing long, slow rides and long, slow runs that increase their VO2 max.
Yeah. Yeah.
Depending on where their starting point is.
Well, and again, that's the key, and that goes back to where we started. Was it depend if you're starting on the couch,
yeah.
Where both you and I were when we re-entered triathlon. Our VO2 max, if I wish we tested, low, right? And so now any training, any exercise intervention, that VO2 max is going to go up. But your VO2 max right now, I'd be hard pressed to think that we can improve that specific. Maybe a little bit, maybe a little, but that's not what's going to make you faster.
Right.
What's going to make you faster is the ability to exercise at intensities closer to your max value.
Well, and in my opinion, honestly, same thing, and to utilize fat as an energy source more effectively.
Yeah, that's right.
Like when I race a 70.3, for example, which is my favorite distance, if I can be at 85% of my VO2 max for 5 hours, and I'm going to be very successful.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But I can't.
Yeah.
Right. But that's something that I'm trying to train is to do that. But like doing a lot of VO2 above VO2 max efforts is not going to do that.
Yeah.
So let's say my VO2 max was 60. If I do a lot of efforts, maybe I get to 61 or 62. But if my percentage doesn't change, it's not going to move me that far.
No, that's right. So let me bring up, I want to hammer that point home because it's such a great point. Let me bring up another file here. Hopefully I've got it open.
But I guess while you're opening this, the point is that, you don't have to know these numbers for yourself
No.
either.
That's right.
I mean, there are ways that within like Training Peaks, or not Training Peaks, Trainer Road or Zwift or whatever, that can actually predict your VO2.
Yeah.
Your Garmin will predict your VO2. It's really interesting. We actually did 3 VO2 max tests on people last week, and I didn't get the last person's what their Garmin said, but the first 2, it was within 1 or 2 points of what their Garmin actually predicted.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's good enough. Like if your Garmin
Yeah,
is
that's
saying
right.
you're 58, you might be 60, you might be 56. Okay, good enough. Like you can build your program around that. You need a little bit more data to get the more of the low end stuff, but
Mm-hmm.
it's still it's pretty. They're getting pretty good. The one thing I will add in that, John, is your Garmin data is only as good as the data you're getting.
Yeah.
And if you never wear a chest strap when you're
Right,
using
right.
Garmin,
Forget it.
your predicted VO2 max is horrible.
Yeah.
Because the measurement on your wrist is just not good enough.
Yeah.
So that's one thing I will add there. It's the caveat is if you're getting VO2 from your Garmin, either your bike computer or your Wahoo or whatever, if you're not wearing a chest strap, if you're using like optical, it's just not going to work.
No, that's right. That's right. Or if you get erroneous data points in there, even like today, I was wearing my chest strap, but it started off at a crazy high number and then it came down because the strap was not secured enough. So then it's going to throw off all those calculations. Okay, so I just put this graph together real quickly. I didn't label the axes, so I'm sorry to my students who may be watching this because I always hammer them about not labeling their axes. So this is VO2 on the y-axis and speed on the x-axis.
Okay, so this running speed?
This is running, and this is
Okay.
from the test. Now, okay, this is cheating a little bit because I calculated speed based upon VO2, but this is running level, okay? So
Yeah.
obviously they're going to be mathematically related perfectly.
Yeah.
But this hammers home the point that you were talking about. This is the max VO2 all the way up here, the highest VO2 during the test.
Yeah.
And the idea is to be able to run not just 12 miles per hour, but to be able to run 13 miles per hour.
Right.
So you're running at a VO2 that's closer to your max value. That's the whole idea of training, is to improve that speed that you can run at. Now, there's another issue of running economy and what have you, but that's the concept, is we want to be able to run at and be able to sustain this pace at 13 miles per hour versus this pace at 12 miles per hour.
Yeah.
And that's what you got to train for.
Yep.
Oh, man. You know what? I just looked at our live feed here, and Chip has a lot of good questions and comments. I'm sorry, Chip. I was.
We were into the data, Chip.
I was too
And
much
just so
into
people
this.
know, like Chip actually owns a vault cart, and he does a lot of
Yep.
VO2 testing. So this actually, you probably have some good questions.
Yeah, he's very well read in this area, and so thanks, Chip. We'll get back to you. Maybe we've got to get you back on and have you as a guest to talk about what you do. This is good. Wow. Okay.
Well, that was an hour.
Yeah. Do you want to go down and do another test?
Do I want to do a VO2 test?
Yeah.
Yeah, I do actually, because
Yeah.
I'm in the beginning of the off season, I think it's actually a good time
Yeah.
to do a test. So maybe this week I'll have a test done. I can do it on the bike.
Yeah, and there's two things that we're going to do, especially with this athlete that we just tested, is not only look at the max parameters, we're going to do the same exact protocol, but we're going to look at what's happening even sub-maximally.
Yeah.
Because that sometimes tells more the story, and that's what these tests are good for. It's not just a singular number that's the end of the test. It's what's happening during the test.
And honestly, for me doing this, I want to know what's happening sub-max.
Yeah, that's right.
the max number for me is more relevant at this point.
Yeah.
It really is like what's happening when I'm at 75%, 80%, 90%. That's the information that I want to get.
Yeah, no, and that's valuable. And that's what we can get from this. So it's good. Awesome.
All right. Well, that was great, John. Nice talking to you again.
Yeah, you
That
too.
was super fun. I learned a lot. It was I love your graphs. That was good. So for those of you that didn't get a chance to see it, log on to the YouTube and have a look at those. Those were really good to see.
Well, I hope our Arizona crew and our Cozumel crew who
Yeah,
may be
good luck
racing
to
this
everybody.
weekend, yeah, maybe they can watch this and maybe we'll put them to sleep.
They just listen to us and put you to sleep. But that's actually my best sleep technique is when I can't sleep. I put on a podcast. I don't know if we ever talked about this, but my thing is I put on a podcast that's really scientific, just a little bit more than my knowledge.
Oh, I like it. Yeah.
And so I know some of the terms and I'm paying attention enough that
Yeah.
I have to really pay attention. So I
Yeah.
don't every other thought goes out of my mind,
Yep.
but I still don't know what they're talking about. So it's perfect.
Mhm. Yeah, right.
So right now I do a lot of biochemistry
Uh,
podcasts that I know the words, but it
Yeah.
doesn't mean a whole lot.
I know. Well, organic chemistry is what drove me to back to biomechanics. So
It's weird though, like when I do fall asleep and I'm still listening to it, I don't learn it.
oh, interesting.
Do
Mhm.
you remember that? That was a thing a long time ago. People would like listen to like their lectures or whatever as they were sleeping, thinking they would learn it, but you actually you don't.
I think there's a movie made out of something like that.
I think you're right.
Hey,
All
good
right.
talking.
Yeah, you too. Have a great weekend.
You too. Talk
Okay,
soon.
bye.
Thanks, everyone.